Imagine waking up and an entire industrial region just had its power unplugged, like overnight.
So it's completely severed.
Yeah, exactly. They lost 6 terawatt hours of electricity, 22 terawatt hours of natural gas, and get this, over 9 million cubic meters of biomass.
It's a staggering loss.
Right. And we are not talking about some, carefully managed phase out over 10 years. Due to geopolitical stress, the cross-border energy imports that this whole region relied on just stopped.
Immediately.
Yeah. And you, as a learner, as someone who wants to really understand the mechanics of the world without drowning in all those dense technical reports, you probably look at a sudden supply shock of that magnitude and think, well, game over.
Right. It sounds like a catastrophic failure.
It does. But instead of collapsing, this crisis actually forced the region to rebuild itself from scratch. It forced them to create this incredible blueprint for hitting 100% renewable energy in one of the most heavy industry-dense areas on the entire planet.
And what they figured out there, it really changes how we should be looking at industrial decarbonization globally.
Absolutely. And that is our mission today. We are exploring a remarkable piece of research titled Dominance of Industry in Energy Demand: Implications for the Energy Transition.
It's such a profound situation to analyze, honestly, because the stakes just could not be higher here.
Right.
We're focusing on Southeast Finland, so specifically the regions of Kymenlaakso and South Karelia.
Okay.
And for decades, this area was entirely defined by its proximity to Russia. It was this thriving hub of cross-border economic activity.
Yeah.
So when those energy ties were severed, it sent this severe economic distress signal across the whole country.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because usually when we discuss national energy transitions, we're looking at macro level policy, right? We look at the whole country's grid.
Exactly, the broad strokes.
But this study deliberately zooms in on this one specific geographic pocket. And it does so because those national averages, they totally obscure what actually happens when you have a massive, dense cluster of heavy industry.
Yeah, and that's the core problem these researchers are tackling. National energy models are super useful for high-level government targets, sure.
Right.
But they lack the high-resolution data. You actually need to understand the physics and the economics of these concentrated industrial hubs.
Because it's a totally different beast.
Exactly. You cannot just take a national average for household solar adoption and apply it to a region that essentially operates as one giant interconnected factory floor.
Right, right.
So the goal here is to model how this specific area can not only survive that massive geopolitical shock we talked about, but transition to a fully sustainable 100% renewable system by 2050.
Basically turning this undeniable economic vulnerability into a huge strategic asset.
Precisely.
Well, to understand the solutions they came up with, I feel like we first have to grasp the terrifying scale of what this region actually consumes.
Oh, it's massive.
The data in the study really puts things in perspective. So nationally, the industry sector accounts for about 42% of Finland's total final energy demand, right?
Which is already high.
Yeah, but in Southeast Finland, industry accounts for a staggering 80%.
80% is just a landscape-altering figure. It means that everything else we usually think of when we talk about energy,
Like heating residential homes.
Right, heating homes, charging electric vehicles, powering commercial office buildings, all of that is just a tiny, tiny fraction of their total consumption.
Oh.
The entire grid is dominated by just a few massive players, specifically pulp and paper mills, heavy cement manufacturing, and steel manufacturing.
And just to give you a sense of the sheer physical power these places draw, the study highlights an electric arc furnace steel recycling plant right in the region.
Yeah, the EAF plant.
That single facility consumes an estimated 169 gigawatt hours of electricity annually.
It's mind-blowing.
Just to melt scrap metal using electrical currents, it draws about 2% of the entire region's electricity demand all by itself.
It's an incredible concentration of demand. And you also have the Kemira Jotsina plant, which runs this large-scale electrolysis unit for chemical production.
Right, and electrolysis is intense.
Oh, very. It involves using massive amounts of electrical current to physically split molecules apart. And while their real-time consumption data is proprietary, the fundamental physics of industrial electrolysis make it one of the largest single electricity consumers in the area.
Okay, I do have to push back slightly on the long-term math here, though,
Sure.
because while I was reading through the demographic projections in this study, I noticed it highlights that southeast Finland is facing a projected 15% population decline by 2050.
Yes, that's true.
So if the population is actively shrinking, doesn't the overall energy demand just drop naturally, like problem solve?
Well, it's a highly logical assumption,
Yeah.
but the demographic decline actually widens the disparity between regular consumers and industry.
Wait, really? How does it widen it?
Because as the population drops, that residential slice of the energy pie shrinks. But those massive industrial sites, especially the 16 pulp and paper mills anchored there, their production capacity doesn't shrink at all.
Oh, because they're not selling to the locals?
Exactly. They aren't tied to the local population size. They are tied to global export markets. So as residential demand falls, the industrial sector becomes even more dominant, pushing way past that 80% mark.
Ah, I
It completely isolates those factories as the single critical variable. You can't rely on just insulating a few thousand homes to fix this grid. You have to fundamentally transform how these massive mills operate.
Okay, so they need to replace a massive influx of lost Russian energy, defossilize their operations entirely, and deal with this increasingly disproportionate industrial baseload.
Yes, a tall order.
How do they actually do it? Well, this study points out a massive, highly concentrated asset sitting right in southeast Finland.
The emissions.
Right, those 16 pulp and paper mills currently produce an estimated 9 million tons of biogenic carbon dioxide every single year.
And 9 million tons of biogenic carbon is an absolute gold mine for the energy transition. It presents this textbook opportunity for point source capture.
Let me break that down for a second because it's a really vital distinction.
Go for it.
Usually when people talk about capturing carbon, they talk about direct air capture, right? Sucking ambient CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is incredibly energy intensive and expensive because atmospheric carbon is so dilute.
It's like finding a needle in a haystack.
Exactly. But point source capture means you put the capture technology right inside the industrial smokestack.
Right at the source.
Right. The CO2 is highly concentrated, making it much, much cheaper to collect. And once you have that biogenic carbon, you unlock the Power-to-X economy.
I'm so glad you brought up Power-to-X because it is the absolute linchpin of their entire transition strategy.
And for anyone unfamiliar with the term, the X just stands for the variable end product. You take surplus renewable electricity, that's the power, and you run it through an electrolyzer to split water into green hydrogen.
Right?
Then you combine that green hydrogen with your captured biogenic CO2. Suddenly, you aren't just storing electricity, you are synthesizing high-value drop-in e-fuels like e-methanol or synthetic aviation fuel.
And the chemistry works beautifully. But chemistry requires resources, and that introduces a severe geographic hurdle for them.
The mismatch.
Yeah. So Southeast Finland has the 9 million tons of concentrated carbon. They also have fantastic solar potential. I think this study estimates they could build out 53.1 gigawatts of solar PV.
Which is huge.
It is, but solar only gets you so far, especially in a Nordic winter,
Yeah, those are dark.
Very.
And
So to run those electrolyzers efficiently and make cheap green hydrogen, you need the steady high-capacity factor of wind power. And that is where the region hits a major roadblock.
the radar issue.
Yes, let's look at the mechanics of why that is such a problem.
Okay.
The best wind resources in Finland are currently being built in the west and the north. Eastern Finland has excellent wind potential as well, actually, but installations there are severely restricted by the Finnish Defense Forces.
Right.
The military relies on radar for national security, specifically monitoring the eastern border. And giant spinning wind turbines create a massive problem called the Doppler effect.
Because the turbine blades are massive and constantly moving, so they reflect the radar waves back at different frequencies, right?
Precisely. To a military radar system, a 200-meter-tall spinning turbine can look identical to a fast-moving aircraft.
Wow.
Or it can just create this massive clutter patch that blinds the radar to actual threats. Because of this, you simply cannot build large-scale wind farms in the southeast without completely compromising national defense.
So it's like having a world-class coffee roaster in one city, but all the fresh spring water you need to brew it is trapped in another city.
That's a great way to put it.
You have all this valuable carbon in the southeast, but the wind power needed to unlock it is out west. You either have to move the coffee beans or you have to move the water. So what does the math actually say?
Well, according to the study's base cost optimization model, so if you look purely at the absolute cheapest way to make this work, It is cheaper to export the captured CO2 out of the southeast.
Which makes sense on paper.
Right. The raw financial models suggest piping or shipping that carbon up to wind-rich areas like Ulu in the north, where the cheap green hydrogen is already being produced, and just doing the chemical synthesis there.
Instead of bringing the power south.
Exactly. Building massive high-voltage transmission lines and hydrogen pipelines down into the southeast is technically more expensive than just moving the carbon out.
But that creates a massive dilemma for the people actually living in southeast Finland.
Oh, absolutely.
If the absolute cheapest option is to just export their captured CO2, the region completely misses out on the power-to-X economic boom. They don't get the new green tech jobs. They don't get the refineries or the tax base.
They're left out.
Yeah, they just go back to being a raw material exporter, sending their carbon up north while keeping the dirty smokestacks right in their backyard.
Which is why the researchers didn't just run one single cost optimization model. They ran 5 distinct scenarios to see how policy choices could alter the region's fate. So they modeled a scenario where point source capture is completely blocked, a scenario where they cap grid capacity at 2020 levels, a scenario maximizing whatever local wind and solar they could squeeze in, and a best policy scenario. But the most crucial model is the one where policymakers forcefully intervene.
And this is where the study revealed a highly counterintuitive strategic insight. They ran a model where policy enforces the local production of e-fuels,
Right.
meaning by mandate, the e-methanol and e-aviation fuels must be synthesized locally in southeast Finland, forcing the national grid to adapt and build the necessary transmission infrastructure to bring the power in.
And the assumption is always that forcing a suboptimal geographic setup like that will cause costs to just skyrocket.
But it doesn't.
No, it really doesn't.
If policymakers enforce the local production of these e-fuels, it only raises the cumulative energy system cost by 1.7% by the year 2050, compared to the absolute cheapest carbon exporting route.
Just 1.7%.
Keeping this massive high-tech economic engine local costs less than a 2% premium over the purely mathematical baseline.
And that 1.7% actually includes the massive capital expenditures of expanding the regional grid to import the wind power. It is a brilliant finding because it proves that regions do not have to sacrifice their own economic development on the altar of, perfect national level cost optimization.
Furthermore, even with the massive baseload demand of keeping all these heavy industries and new e-fuel refineries running locally, the levelized cost of electricity at the LCOE in the region actually plummets over time.
It's wild.
According to the study, it drops from 85 euros per megawatt hour in 2020 down to roughly 34 euros per megawatt hour by 2050.
And that price drop is driven by the sheer economies of scale and the fact that renewable energy, once built, operates with zero marginal fuel costs.
Right, the wind is free.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we also have to contextualize why paying that 1.7% premium is a strategic necessity. The study explicitly connects this to a regional initiative called Resilieast.
Ah, the defense-oriented energy program.
Yes. Resilieast operates on the principle that energy infrastructure is defense infrastructure. The goal is to accelerate local renewable generation and high-tech fuel production to bolster economic resilience, which directly bolsters national security.
Make them independent.
Exactly. When you live in a border region that recently saw all its energy ties abruptly severed, energy independence stops being an environmental buzzword and becomes a literal defense strategy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. So paying a tiny 1.7% premium to build the e-fuels locally acts as a state-backed security premium. You are buying geopolitical insurance for your domestic supply chains.
That is the exact underlying logic.
Okay.
You secure the fuel supply, you retain the workforce, and you stabilize the region.
Okay, so let's walk through the physical reality of this. They pay the premium, they build the massive solar farms, they upgrade the transmission lines to import wind power from the West, and they commit to synthesizing e-fuels locally. How does a regional grid actually handle continuous heavy industrial manufacturing when the power supply is based on fluctuating weather? Like the sun goes down, the wind starts blowing, but a massive paper mill can't just pause its machines without losing millions.
This is perhaps the most impressive technical hurdle addressed in this study. It requires flipping the identity of the factory from a passive consumer of energy into an active, stabilizing battery for the grid.
Okay.
And the foundational step for that is the total direct electrification of industrial heat.
Which is huge because currently these massive mills burn a tremendous amount of biomass just to generate the steam and heat they need for their chemical processes.
Right. But by 2050, under the best policy scenario, electric heating boilers will completely dominate the landscape. The study projects that electric boilers will provide 60% of the total heat supply in the region.
Generating the extreme heat required for heavy industry using purely electricity sounds incredibly difficult.
It is technically demanding, for sure, but the commercial technology is advancing rapidly to meet the need. The study points to emerging real-world applications, proving this is viable at scale. For instance, they highlight Heidelberg Materials, which is testing a 300-kilowatt plasma-heated cement kiln.
Let's explain how that works conceptually, because a plasma kiln sounds like science fiction.
It really does.
Instead of shoveling coal or gas into a burner to heat the cement, you pass a powerful electrical current through a gas. This strips the electrons from the gas molecules, turning it into plasma.
Which is insanely hot.
Yeah, that plasma generates an incredibly intense localized heat field, hot enough to manufacture cement without any fossil fuel combustion.
It is a remarkable piece of engineering. But applying electric heat at a paper mill brings us back to your earlier point. Paper mills run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Right.
They do not care if a cloud passes over the solar farm.
Exactly. So how do they become flexible consumers without shutting down the factory floor and sending all the workers home every time the wind dies down?
The secret is a concept called thermal decoupling. Flexibility does not mean stopping the final production line. Instead of using electricity to generate heat at the exact microsecond the factory needs it, they utilize thermal energy storage, or TES.
So think of it like building a colossal industrial-scale thermos.
That is the perfect analogy. When the wind is blowing hard out west and the solar panels are at peak capacity, electricity on the grid is abundant and incredibly cheap.
Practically free.
Right. During those hours, the factory runs its electric boilers at absolute maximum capacity, drawing massive amounts of power. But they don't use all that heat immediately. They dump the excess heat into these massive insulated thermal storage buffers, the thermos.
And then the weather shifts. The wind dies down, grid electricity becomes scarce, and the price spikes.
And when the price spikes, the factory simply turns the electric boilers off. They stop drawing power from the grid entirely.
Wow.
But the paper production doesn't slow down for a second, because the machines just draw the necessary heat out of the thermal storage buffers they filled up earlier.
The study also mentions that the factories achieve flexibility by oversizing their intermediate processing capacities.
Yes. Let's look at the mechanical pulping process as an example. Grinding raw wood into pulp is incredibly energy-intensive. Under this new blueprint, a mill will deliberately build a bigger, higher-capacity wood grinder than their downstream paper machines strictly require.
Oh, I see. So when renewable power is dirt cheap, they run this oversized grinder at 120% capacity, chewing through massive amounts of wood and creating a massive surplus of pulp, which they just store in a physical silo.
Exactly.
Then, when electricity gets expensive, they ramp the energy-hungry grinder down to nearly zero. The downstream paper machines just keep pulling from the silo, completely insulated from the price spike on the grid.
The energy-hungry steps ramp up and down dynamically to absorb the peaks and valleys of wind and solar power, while the final product output stays perfectly flat.
That's brilliant.
The entire factory acts as a massive shock absorber for the renewable grid.
But implementing that requires a massive behavioral shift, right? I mean, the mathematical model clearly shows that this thermal decoupling saves the whole energy system money.
On paper, yes.
But it is the factory owners who actually have to buy the giant thermal storage tanks and pay for the oversized grinding machines.
Which is why the transition isn't just about engineering. It is about market design. Industrial stakeholders are incredibly pragmatic. They will only build these massive thermal buffers if there are targeted market incentives.
Right. They need a reason.
You need highly dynamic, real-time electricity pricing so the factory can actually profit by turning off during peak hours. And you likely need capacity payments from the grid operators to help offset the capital cost of installing that flexibility.
Okay, so we have solved the energy source through renewables, we've solved the grid stability through thermal decoupling and electric boilers, and we are capturing the smokestack carbon.
A lot of wins.
Once a heavy industrial region achieves all of this, what happens next? What is the final evolution of the traditional pulp and paper mill?
It leads to a complete paradigm shift for the forestry and paper sector. Historically, a paper mill cuts down trees, makes cardboard, and burns the wood scraps for low-grade power.
But this study outlines a radically different identity. These facilities evolve into central hubs for advanced biomanufacturing and the power-to-X economy.
Think about what happens to the byproducts. Once you have access to clean electricity and advanced chemical processing, the waste streams become incredibly valuable.
Like what?
Well, the study details how lignin, which is the rigid polymer that gives wood its structure and is traditionally just burned as waste, can be repurposed. By processing and baking lignin at high temperatures, you can produce biographite.
And biographite is a highly sought-after material for manufacturing the anodes in electric vehicle batteries.
Yes, the European battery market is desperately looking for sustainable domestic supply chains. There are already commercial entities in the Kotka region working on producing biographite from wood byproducts.
That's incredible.
And the innovation doesn't stop there. The carbon-rich streams can be synthesized into advanced carbon fibers, or even silicon carbide, which is critical for high-tech semiconductors. The paper mill essentially becomes a high-tech chemical refinery.
But we should look at the worst-case scenario, just to be thorough. What if the regional grid upgrades just don't happen fast enough?
That's a real risk.
Yeah, what if the transmission lines get bogged down in permitting and they physically cannot get enough wind power into southeast Finland to synthesize all these e-fuels and high-tech bioproducts?
Even in that constrained scenario, the region's assets remain highly valuable. The study provides a fallback option centered on BCCS bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration.
So they still install the point source capture on the smokestacks, and they still collect the 9 million tons of biogenic CO2.
Right.
But without the massive electrical grid to process it into fuel, what do they do with it?
They pipe it to the coast, load it onto specialized transport ships, and send it to permanent storage facilities.
Oh.
Yeah, it could be sent to geological storage sites deep under the seabed off the coast of Norway, or it could be shipped to Iceland for carbon mineralization, where the CO2 is injected into basalt rock and literally turns into stone over time.
The implication of that is massive. If they are capturing biogenic carbon that trees originally pulled out of the atmosphere and permanently burying it, the entire region transforms into a net negative emission hub.
Exactly. They aren't just cleaning up their own operations. They are actively removing historical carbon from the global cycle.
Which has massive value.
Huge value. They could monetize this by offering carbon removal services to other nations or multinational corporations that have incredibly hard to abate sectors.
It completely flips their geopolitical and economic standing. They go from being entirely dependent on imported Russian fossil fuels just to keep the lights on to being a critical, profitable provider of European decarbonization.
It is a remarkable trajectory from vulnerability to absolute resilience.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this right now? We started by looking at a region that suffered a massive overnight geopolitical shock.
Their energy supply was severed.
Right. They were anchored by massive, rigid, incredibly energy-hungry, heavy industrial plants. But instead of an economic collapse, they used the crisis to flip the script entirely.
Completely revolutionized it.
By leaning into biogenic point source capture, by fully embracing the direct electrification of heavy heat through technologies like plasma kilns, and by treating their massive factories as flexible thermal batteries instead of rigid consumers, they proved a 100% renewable system is possible.
And crucially, they do it while actively driving their long-term electricity prices down to 34 euros per megawatt hour.
Which is just wild. And every mechanism, every model, and every scenario we walk through today is detailed in the incredible research provided in Dominance of Industry and Energy Demand, Implications for the Energy Transition.
It leaves us with a critical strategic question to end on, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
We have seen how a sudden, severe supply shock forced this specific region to leverage its oldest, heaviest industries to pioneer future battery materials and e-fuels.
Yeah.
So take a look around your own region's economy. What untapped, overlooked industrial footprint, a smoking chimney, a massive agricultural processing plant, a seemingly rigid factory, could actually be the exact geopolitical asset needed to fund your region's next major leap in the energy transition.
Think about the massive potential hiding in plain sight the next time you see a factory smokestack. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.